Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I hope you had a great week this week, as always. If you're watching this, you'll see that I'm in another new place. So I'm now in Sofia in Bulgaria. Going to be staying here for about 2 months. I had a great time in Turkey last month, but did a lot of traveling and not a lot of work. I only recorded one episode while I was there. And it's a shame because the background in Turkey was really good, I thought. So, one of the problems with traveling a lot is you never know what your place is going to be like. So in all of the videos I have, well, every time I go to a new place, I have to find a new setup and make it work. But hey, it's okay. We can work with that. So in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the second day of my trip with my grandpa to try and see the Northern Lights for him. If you missed what happened on the first day, be sure to check out the previous podcast and blog, of course, where I talk about what happened on the first day. But yeah, today we're going to talk about the second day. It was our second and final day in Iceland. So could we see the Northern Lights? Let's have a look. Okay, so before we get into this recording, a couple of questions for you to answer, as always. In this recording, I'm not only going to be talking about the Northern Lights, but also what we did in the day. So the first question is, what did I do in the day? Try to get as many details as you can as well. And secondly, listen out for some phrases that use the past perfect or the past perfect continuous. Okay, so in the second part of the podcast today, we'll be focusing on those phrases. So when you listen the first time, see if you can identify those and be aware of them. Here we go. So day 2 of chasing the Northern Lights in Iceland. So day 2 started sleepily, but some eggs on toast and a few coffees quickly fixed that. By 9:30 we were back out on the streets of Reykjavik, and of course it was still dark, but we were ready for another day of adventures and our second attempt at seeing the Northern Lights. So I had booked tickets for Iceland's Golden Circle tour, and this is a trip that I really recommend if your time in Iceland is really short, like ours. So this is a trip around 3 of Iceland's iconic sites. It takes you by bus and it starts and ends in Reykjavik. It also includes a trip in the evening to see the Northern Lights as well. So here's how our day went. So the first stop was Thingvellir. No idea with Icelandic pronunciation, sorry, but I think it's Thingvellir National Park. So an hour's drive outside of Reykjavik, we arrived at the frozen, difficult to say, at the frozen Thingvellir Park. In fact, we had been there the night before on our lights tour, but it looked very different in the day. So this was the previous site of Iceland's parliament, so Iceland's government, between the 10th and 18th centuries. And there's a museum that you can visit if you want to learn more, or if you want to get warm while you're there. The park looks really nice on pictures, but in the winter, at the beginning of January, it was totally covered in snow, but still quite an impressive sight. But after a quick walk around, we were back on the bus and on to the next stop. So stop 2 was Haukadalur, I don't know, geothermal valley. And this place was cool. It looks like something from a dinosaur movie when you arrive there. So when you climb off the bus, you walk alongside some streams of really hot thermal water coming from the ground, and it melts all of the snow around it. The main attraction here is a geyser, which is like a natural hot spring which erupts every 10 minutes or so. So it shoots water up into the sky. It was difficult for Grandpa to walk here because the water made the path quite slippy. But we made it to a little bench and we sat down to have a rest and waited for the eruption, which was really cool. And after this, we had been walking a lot and Grandpa was tired. So we grabbed him a coffee from the visitor center and jumped back on the bus. It's worth saying here that I'm quite impressed by how much coffee my grandpa can drink. He drinks a lot of that stuff every day. Anyway, as soon as we got back on the bus, the warm air hit our faces and we all fell asleep before we got to the next stop. And it's a good thing that we had a sleep on the bus, because the final stop required quite a long walk. So the final stop was the Gullfoss waterfall. Yeah, it was a good thing that we had some rest on the bus, particularly because Grandpa was getting tired. Plus, it had started snowing as well. But Grandpa pushed himself to make the walk, and I'm glad he did, because the Gullfoss waterfall was probably the most impressive part of the Golden Circle tour. We walked there. It took about 10 minutes to get there, and when we finally arrived at the viewpoint, we were freezing cold. Also, the wind had been blowing against us all the way, so we were cold and tired. But we took some selfies with the waterfall, holding our phones very tightly because it was so windy and the wind could have blown the phones out of our hand. But it was good. And then we battled the weather one more time to get back to the bus. On the journey back to Reykjavik, Grandpa couldn't keep his eyes open. Over the last 2 days, we had walked a lot and slept a little, and it was catching up with him a little bit. I was really proud of him, though. He had nearly given up a few times that day, but he battled through. He deserved a good rest before our final attempt at seeing the lights that night. So, we arrived back in Reykjavik at around 5 p.m. and had a few hours to rest before the lights tour started. So we dropped Grandpa at the Airbnb for a nap, and me and Danny went outside to look for food. On the bus, we'd been talking about what we wanted for dinner, and the choice was hot dogs from Reykjavik's famous hot dog stand. So I had read about this online before our trip, and I wanted to check it out. There's a famous hot dog stand in Reykjavik where you can buy hot dogs. And it turns out that they were pretty normal hot dogs. I think the main attraction with this place is that it's probably Reykjavik's most affordable food. Grandpa liked them anyway, and after filling up with them, he was ready to get outside again and search for the lights one more time. So this brings us to our second attempt at seeing the Northern Lights, and like the first one, I'm going to read this as a diary. So this is my diary of our second attempt at seeing the Northern Lights. Okay, 8:30 p.m, Reykjavik bus station. Expectations are lower and tiredness is higher tonight. It's a bigger bus and more people, but does that matter? We have a beer together and chat about the day, and I'm starting to think the Northern Lights aren't the most important part of this trip anymore. 9 p.m, the bus sets off. I appreciate the heating on the bus, but why is it always so high? We take off all of our layers. It's really hard to stay awake. 9:50. We arrive at a small church in the middle of nowhere. It's lit up and it looks beautiful. This is our only stop because the big bus tours are less flexible. The guide tells us our best chance is to walk away into the wilderness, away from the lights of the church. A few more buses pull up and people start walking into the darkness. Grandpa's cold and tired and he wants to stay on the bus. 10 p.m. We're outside. Me and Danny had been trying to persuade Grandpa to try one last time, and we were successful. We link arms with Grandpa in the middle and slowly start walking out across the snow. 10:15 p.m. We're slower than the others, but that means we're alone in the wilderness, and it's a special moment. The moon is bright, not good for the lights, but it lights up the sky, and the views back across the church are incredible. We stop and admire it together. 10:30. I really need the toilet, but there are no toilets around. I try to go behind a small building and I nearly sink into the snow. 10:45. We join the rest of the group and realize that we're actually by the sea. We huddle together to keep warm and have a laugh with some of the others. We just need that cloud to disappear for 10 seconds, says Grandpa. 11 p.m. I asked the guides about our chances. We'll give it half an hour, they say, but I can see from their faces that our chances are not great. 11:30 p.m. The group heads back to the bus. We're amongst the last ones standing. Grandpa wants to go back too because he's worried he'll delay the bus because he's slow. No chance. We're staying here till the last second. 11:40. The last second comes and it's time to head back. We tried our best. We'd been standing by the sea in the middle of nowhere in the freezing cold for nearly 2 hours. 11:55. Can I put my head on your shoulder, mate? Grandpa rests his head on my shoulder and goes to sleep. Me and Danny compare pictures on our phones and chat about the day. We forget about the Northern Lights and realize that we've shared moments together that will become lifelong memories. So, going home then. So we didn't see the Northern Lights this time. The next morning, we flew home to be greeted by our family. Over a cup of tea, we talked about the things we had done. The next day, I flew to Taiwan to continue traveling the world as a digital nomad. But a few days later, me and Danny received a message from Grandpa in our group chat. And I think this is a great way to end the podcast today. I'm going to read the message for you. Matt and Dan, I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed our long weekend up in Iceland. It's been a while since we had any just lads time. And I'm very appreciative of the opportunity we had to enjoy the break together, even though we didn't get to see the lights. I'm aware of the efforts you both had to make to organise and look after me, and so as a special thank you, I want to send some money to you both. Love to you both, and thanks again, Grandpa. So I replied, thanks, Grandpa. I'll save it for our next trip. Okay, so as always, well done for getting through that recording. If you made it through the first part, I'm really interested to hear, guys, your opinions on the length of these podcasts. So please feel free to get in touch with me on Instagram or any other social media and let me know, do you think the recordings are too long, too short, or are they okay? Really interested to hear your feedback on that. So, before we got into the recording, I set you a question as always, and that question was, what activities did we do on the second day? And try to get some details as well. So on the second day, we did a tour. It was the Golden Circle tour, and hopefully you caught all of the activities that were included on that. So there were 3 stops. The first stop was the Thingvellir National Park. And details, you could have heard that it was very cold, it was covered in snow, and this was the site of Iceland's parliament in the past. Second stop was the Hákadalur geothermal valley. Again, details, I described what it looked like, so hot water coming from the ground, melting the snow. And we watched a geyser here. So the geyser is when the hot water kind of erupts from the ground. And the third stop was the Gullfoss waterfall. And details were that the weather got worse, so it was snowing a lot, it was very cold. We had to walk to get to the waterfall, but the waterfall was very impressive. And maybe a fourth activity as well. In the evening, we had some hot dogs for dinner. So hopefully you all caught that and followed that. Okay, but I also asked you to listen for sentences in the past perfect and the past perfect continuous. And that's what we're going to focus on now in this second part of the podcast. Okay, so in the previous podcast, when I talked about day 1 in Iceland, we talked about the past perfect then. But let's recap that very quickly. So to make a sentence or to build a sentence in the past perfect, we need the subject and then had, and then the third form of the verb. Let me explain really quickly what I mean by the third form of the verb. So all verbs in English have 3 forms. Sometimes some of those forms are the same and sometimes they're all different. Okay? If we take the verb eat as an example, first form is eat, second form is ate, third form is eaten. So in the past perfect, we would use the third form, eaten. Okay. Okay, I know that verbs also take ing, and we might say that that's another form, but when I teach this, I like to say three forms. I think that keeps it simple. So that's the past perfect, and we did mention that last time. How about the past perfect continuous then? So to build a sentence in the past perfect continuous, we need the subject, had, been, and then the verb with ing. So again, if we take eat as our example, it would be I had been eating. Okay, past perfect versus past perfect continuous then. What is the difference? Well, we often use the past perfect continuous when we want to emphasize that something happened for a longer time, or that something was a repeated action, so it happened many, many times. The emphasis is often on the time as well when we use the past perfect continuous. So if I want to say how long an action happened for 1 hour, for a few hours, for 10 minutes, then I'm more likely to use the past perfect continuous. Okay, and let's remember that past perfect expresses an action before another action in the past. Okay, if you're not clear on that, remember to check out the previous podcast where we talked about that in more detail. One more comment on past perfect and past perfect continuous before we get into this. It's difficult, okay? Everybody finds this tense difficult to deal with. It's something that we usually learn a little bit later on in our English studies, so it's not one of the first tenses that we come across. And to be honest, in real life, we don't need to use it that often. Many, many times we could just use the past simple and replace past perfect. But if we want to advance to the next level with our English, it's something that's important to learn and to become comfortable with. Okay, so we've had a little explanation of the tense there, past perfect and past perfect continuous. Let's see if we can make that a little bit clearer with some examples from the recording. Okay, so first example then, let me read the sentence for you again. So, I had booked tickets for Iceland's Golden Circle tour. I had booked tickets for Iceland's Golden Circle tour. Okay, why do I use past perfect here? I'm talking about the trip. The trip was in the past. And before the trip, I booked those tickets. Okay, so the action that happened before the other action in the past was that I booked the tickets. So I had booked tickets before I arrived in Iceland. Okay, 1 hour's drive outside of Reykjavik, we arrived at Thingvellir Park. In fact, we had been there the night before. Okay, so 1 hour's drive outside of Reykjavik, we arrived at Thingvellir National Park, but we had been there the night before. This is a great example that shows the past perfect, an action happening before another action in the past. Okay, so one action is we arrived at Thingvellir National Park. That's one action. But before that, the night before, we went there as well. Okay, so when I arrived at Thingvellir National Park, I had already been there the night before. Okay, a couple of examples with past perfect there. Let's have a look at a few past perfect continuous examples. Okay, so as I was talking about the geothermal valley, I mentioned that we arrived at a bench and we rested to watch the geyser eruption. Okay, we had been walking a lot and Grandpa was tired. Okay, we had been walking a lot. So why did I choose the past perfect continuous here? It's because I want to emphasize that the action, walking, happened for a long time, okay? It's quite clear, I think. We had been walking a lot. So past perfect continuous is the right choice there because it shows that the action, walking, happened for a long time. Okay, moving on, what was the next example of past perfect continuous? Okay, so as I was talking about the waterfall, the Gullfoss waterfall, I mentioned that when we arrived at the viewpoint, we were freezing. and the wind had been blowing against us all the way. Okay, so when we arrived at the viewpoint, we were freezing because the wind had been blowing against us all the way. Okay, so here's one action in the past, we arrived, and then an action before that in the past was that the wind had been blowing. Okay, why do I choose the past perfect continuous there? It's the same reason. I want to show that the wind was blowing for a long time, right? It wasn't just one quick wind, it was a constant wind. So the wind had been blowing emphasizes that the wind was blowing all the time, okay, for a long time. Okay, now an interesting one here because in the recording I used the past perfect, but maybe I could have used the past perfect continuous here. So let's look at this one. Still talking about the waterfall, I mentioned that on the way back to Reykjavik, Grandpa couldn't keep his eyes open and he was sleeping a lot. And I said that over the last 2 days, we had walked a lot and slept little. Okay, so we had walked a lot and slept little. So, before this journey, before the bus journey, over the last 2 days, we had walked a lot. Okay, so I chose the past perfect there. I'm not putting much emphasis on the length of time that we walked. I'm just saying that we completed a lot of walking. Okay, but really, I could use the past perfect continuous here as well. So I could say, over the last 2 days, we had been walking a lot and sleeping very little. Okay, because walking is a continuous process. It's something that happens for a longer period of time. The meaning is very, very similar, but if I used the past perfect continuous, I would be putting more emphasis on the length of time that we were walking. By using the past perfect, we had walked, the emphasis is more on the completion of the action. So we finished a lot of walking by that time. Hope that's clear, guys. And if at any point, as I mentioned, let's be honest, past perfect continuous, it's difficult, it's confusing. So if at any point this is not clear to you, please feel free to give me a message, comment on the blog on the website, and I'll be more than happy to clear things up and answer any questions as well. I think we have a couple more examples of past perfect continuous, so let's check those out. Yeah, okay. Of course, that night we had hot dogs for our dinner. I mentioned that we took Grandpa back to the Airbnb to have a nap while me and Danny went to search for food. And on the bus, we had been talking about what we wanted for dinner. Okay. So me and Danny went to find some food, and before that, on the bus, we had been talking about it. Okay, past perfect continuous here because I'm talking about an action in the past before another action. Okay, so before we went to look for food, we had been talking about what to eat, and I chose the continuous form because we were talking for some time, right? It's not just one word, it's a conversation. Okay, so we had been talking. All right. The next example was one from the past perfect. So still talking about the hot dogs. I mentioned that I had read about this hot dog stand online before our trip, and I was keen to check it out. So hopefully by this point, guys, we're quite clear on past perfect. When I arrived at this hot dog stand, I knew about it because before the trip, I had read about it. Okay. Could I use past perfect continuous here? Maybe. I could say I had been reading about it online. That would work, but that puts more emphasis on the length of time that I spent reading. And really, I didn't spend a long time reading. So it's better for me to say I had read about it. Okay. One final example, I think it's with the past perfect continuous. And this was when we were on our Northern Lights trip on the second evening. So we were on the bus for a while. We arrived at this church in the middle of nowhere. Grandpa was very, very tired and he didn't really want to get off the bus. So me and Danny had to persuade him for quite a while. Finally, he got off the bus. which was good because me and Danny had been trying to persuade him for a long time. Okay, so he got off the bus, that's one action in the past, and before that, me and Danny had been trying to persuade him. Okay, again, past perfect continuous because he really didn't want to get off the bus and we had to persuade him for quite a long time. Okay, the emphasis is that it took us some time to persuade him. So we had been trying to persuade him is the right choice there. Okay, guys. Oh, we got one more example, and it's past perfect continuous again. It's funny, when I was preparing this topic, I wanted to include a lot of past perfect continuous, but I thought, it's mostly past perfect simple. But actually, as I review it now, there is quite a lot of past perfect continuous in there. Okay, so the end of the northern, excuse me. So the end of the Northern Lights trip then, yeah, we were waiting and waiting, and finally the last second came and it was time to head back. So we tried our very best, and we had been standing by the sea in the middle of nowhere for 2 hours. Okay, so we had to head back. All right, we headed back. That's one action in the past. Headed just means went. Okay, so we went back to the bus. But before that, we had been standing for nearly 2 hours. Okay. Remember, when we include the length of time of the action, so when we say how long the action lasted, we're going to use the past perfect continuous. Okay. So this action lasted for 2 hours. We were standing for 2 hours. So we need to use the past perfect continuous. We had been standing for nearly 2 hours. Okay. All right. And that is it, guys. That's it for the past perfect continuous. We've talked a lot in the last 2 podcasts about past perfect simple and now past perfect continuous, and I hope that's made things a little bit clearer for you. Please remember that these are very, very difficult tenses. Every English learner finds these ones difficult to understand. Okay, so if you're struggling with this, you're definitely not alone. All right. Please feel free to give me a message if you're not clear on that, or if you have any specific examples that you'd like to check, or any further questions. I'm definitely more than happy to help with that. Okay, so that is the end of the 3 podcast mini-series, let's call it, about the trip to Iceland. So we didn't see the Northern Lights, unfortunately, but we had a great time, and there's always next time, right? Remember to tune in for the next podcast and keep your eye on the website for the next blog as well. We're going to be moving on with the journey now, and the next destination was Taiwan. I'm really excited to start talking about my experiences there. Thanks very much for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time.